Hey there everyone, welcome back to Utility Sports. Really excited for this video as we're going to discuss the 10 best remaining free agents out there in free agency at this point. Perhaps there's a small chance that one of these players ends up getting signed between the time I'm recording this and the time the video actually publishes. So if that happens, just acknowledge that that's a real possibility. Hopefully you guys do enjoy this video. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more. Quick disclaimer, if you disagree with where these guys are ranked, especially if it's like by 1 or 2 spots, it's really not that big of a deal. It's more of a kind of holistic look at who's still out there and kind of the priority I would give these players. And the first player I want to touch on here is an honorable mention, a guy that I couldn't really find a good ranking for in this video. To me, I think I'm a little bit higher on him from a coaching standpoint of, hey, if I had this guy on my roster, there's some interesting things you can do X's and O's wise that other players at his position just don't quite give you that same versatility. And it's a very high profile player, a very profile name in Bol Bol, who was kind of surprising that the Orlando Magic waived him. Now, I know down the stretch of the season, Goga Bitadze started stealing some of his minutes and really wasn't in the same role that he was early on in the year, and he hasn't strung together a good full season yet in the NBA. But in only 21 minutes a game, he was very productive this season, I would say, averaging over 9 points a game in that time, nearly 6 rebounds in that time as well, and over a 1 block shot per game. He actually led the NBA in 3-pointers blocked this year, which kind of is a testament to his length, size, and his fluidity on the perimeter defensively. Now, I wouldn't say he's a reliable one-on-one perimeter defender, but he's an intriguing defensive playmaker, and he shot over 50% from the field. Now, the three-point numbers aren't quite there yet in terms of where you'd want them to be, but he did shoot very well from the free throw line. Of course, was a pretty solid transition player this year for Orlando, and I think, there's a bunch of teams that I think, there's just not a lot of players who are 7'2" or above. And if you have the opportunity to bring one of these guys in, it's another option to do different things with. I think he could be an intriguing zone center where you put him in the middle and say, okay, your whole goal is to block shots and challenge around the rim. You don't have to move around a bunch. You could also use him as a zone corner defender and say, look, you're super lengthy. In situations where you have to rotate in, you're a really great weak side rim protector, shot blocker, and you also provide some intriguing dynamic length out on the perimeter. So I think there's areas in the league where Bol Bol could thrive. I think San Antonio should be a team that looks into getting him. Imagine the length of Victor Wembanyama and Bol Bol together. I want to at least see it. Please let me see it, San Antonio. Make it happen. But I do think from a realistic standpoint of coaching, for me, out of the guys on the list you're going to see in this video, Bol Bol gives you kind of an intriguing blend of different things offensively and defensively that some of the other guys on the list don't give you, which is why for me he's an honorable mention. Couldn't find a real spot I loved him at. My 10th best free agent still remaining at this point is Austin Rivers. Now, he only played about 19 minutes a game this past year for Minnesota, and his statistical production isn't really there, but I do think he is, in fact, one of the smarter defensive players still out on the market. I think he does a lot of really good stuff as a help defender, as a guard. I think he does a very good job in switch situations when he's matched up with bigs to front. He works very, very hard to get in front of these bigger players and at least make the entry pass a little bit more difficult than you typically would think it would be with Austin Rivers defending down in the post. And I think he's just an overall smart player, smart veteran who accepted a small role in Minnesota. In fact, I would say he was underplayed, underutilized there. I think the Timberwolves should have given him more minutes than they did. They, played other guards in their rotation over him. But what I noticed is when Austin Rivers was in the game, he was pretty impactful. I think he did some really nice stuff for the Timberwolves this past season. He didn't play in 60-plus games, but I think when he was out there, he was impactful. He's smart. He's still only about 30 years old, so it's not like he's one of these 35, 36-year-old veterans where you're kind of hoping for maybe a little bit of a last spurt. I think that there's still a couple of years yet out of Austin Rivers that you can rely on. And for me, with him, he's a player that he knocks down perimeter shots. He's got one of the better triple threat jab steps in the league. Not a lot of people know that, but he's actually really, really dangerous out of the corner. So for me, I'm hoping that Austin Rivers catches on somewhere. I think he can be a really nice third or fourth guard for a team in limited minutes. Now, I'm not expecting him to play 28, 29 minutes a game now at this point, but can he give you 18 to 25 on any given night? Yes, he can, and he can fill it up. He can play on the ball, off the ball a bit. And because of that, I think he's one of the better remaining free agents at this point of the free agency process. My 9th best free agent still remaining is Derrick Jones Jr., who I was actually very surprised he opted out of his contract with Chicago. He did have a player option, and I was very surprised by the fact that he opted out because I thought he was a no-brainer opt-in. lock yourself in for one more year on a contract worth $3+ million. I didn't think he was going to have a big market, and now, as you can see, about a week into free agency, he's still unsigned. So I felt pretty good about the fact that he should have opted in. Clearly, his agent or just himself did not want to be in Chicago, or felt like there was a market out there that didn't exist. We'll see what happens with Derrick Jones Jr., but I do think a player who played very limited minutes, 14 minutes a game this past season for Chicago, you're not looking at him as a statistical player like, oh, well, his stats suggest he's really good. You're looking at him as like he gives you an intriguing skill set that a lot of other players in the league can't match. He's one of the most athletic wings in the league. Of course, we know that back from his G League days, even when he was jumping out of the gym. I think he's lost a slight bit of balance, but he had so much to begin with. He's still more athletic than a lot of other guys. So airplane mode is still in effect here. And I do think he's a player that, if you're looking to build somewhat of a high-speed, high-paced transition offense, he could be a really nice get. I look at a team like Sacramento, if they had a way to bring him in on a veteran's minimum, I think he could give them a really nice cutter off the backside, and just give them a little bit more vertical pop than what they currently have. I also look at a team like Dallas, who they have their mid-level still to work with, $9 million away from the first apron. Derrick Jones Jr., look, with Kyrie Irving, they want to play a faster pace. With Luka Doncic, they play very slow. So if you're looking for a guy who can complement Kyrie, complement Jaden Hardy potentially, you're looking at Derrick Jones Jr. as an interesting wing get for them, and a player that I think makes some sense in spot minutes in the rotation. Moving on to my 8th best free agent remaining, that is TJ Warren, formerly of the Phoenix Suns. Now, I think TJ Warren, an intriguing player, because you look back to his Indiana days where he really started to break out after getting traded there from Phoenix to begin with initially. Of course, the bubble, he played like an MVP during that stretch. That's not what I'm banking on here with TJ Warren. I'm looking at a player who's got some size to him, and anytime you can find a sized player with skill, typically there's a market for them. Now, TJ Warren's still sitting out there. The Phoenix Suns have been very active, kind of addressing things that they needed around Beal, Booker, and Durant. I think they've had a very good offseason for themselves. But you look at a player like TJ Warren being kind of the odd man out because they prioritize defense, length, athleticism, and Warren's game is a little bit more built off of skill and shot making. And I think if you're looking for other teams that could use that, there's a few around the league. Anytime you can bring in a guy, again, around that 6'8" mark who can handle and score, there should be a market for that player. Now, he's been very injury prone, has missed a lot of time over the last 3 or 4 seasons, never really caught back on in Phoenix after getting traded there from Brooklyn. So it'll be interesting to see what ultimately happens with him. I think he's a player who's going to sign for the minimum, which I still think is definitely worth doing if you're another team. If you can bring in TJ Warren on the minimum, he's a significantly better signing than most minimum level players are typically, and I think because of that, he's a player who can be a pretty high impact guy for his price point, so I would definitely look into bringing him in as another team. My 7th best remaining free agent, it feels like we're just going through all of these different wings here, but it's Justise Winslow, formerly of the Portland Trailblazers, of course, was a former lottery pick for the Miami Heat way back when. And Winslow, you know, he's always had the skills that I think intrigue a lot of people for his size, kind of as a wing build, as a player who can slash, cut, defend, but also has a little bit of playmaking in there where people at points thought maybe this guy has real point forward potential. Now, he hasn't been able to stay on the court. That's always been a big issue with him, is, you know, just being able to play minutes consistently and playing games consistently. Outside of his rookie year, I don't believe he's played in 70 plus games since his rookie season. So for that, there's already going to be some concerns about what's his availability. But if you're looking at it from a perspective of, hey, if you're a team and you're looking for a 9th or 10th guy to add to your rotation, that's where Justise Winslow probably fills in best, because you're not going to be overly reliant on him. You're not expecting big minutes from him, and if he misses some games, it's not a big deal because you probably have other pieces, the 11th, 12th guy in the rotation, maybe they can step up and fulfill those 8 to 15 minutes a night, right? And I think that's really the thing with Justise Winslow, is you're looking for a player who, by the way, he's still only 26 years old. He'll be going into his age 27 season. I think that, you know, we expect him to be like 30 years old because it feels like forever ago that he was drafted. He was drafted so young. So I still think that there's more you can get out of Justise Winslow. At moments, I feel like he's starting to break out, and then he just never really sustains that level of play and doesn't stay on the court long enough to really continue to showcase those things. But from a defensive playmaking standpoint, there's room in this league for Justise Winslow, is what I'm ultimately trying to say here. And for me at this point, with the other remaining free agent options, I like it quite a bit for him at this current spot. My sixth best remaining free agent, this is really the part of the video where I start to get more and more excited about some of these young players and where they could potentially be, because I think there's still a lot of room for some of these players to grow. And then toward the top of the list, there's even some players who I think could be good impact contributors right now for teams if they land in the right situations. But sixth here, I have Trendon Watford, who was a surprise release from the Portland Trailblazers earlier this offseason. I just don't think a lot of people were expecting that, especially coming off of a pretty good sophomore season for himself with the Blazers. Now, no, Portland in his time there, they weren't very competitive. The Blazers have been pretty bad since adding Trendon Watford to their roster, but I don't really think it's his fault. I think it's more, you know, Dame's been in and out with some injuries. Of course, now he's mostly out and not in at this point with that trade request. But, you know, I think moving off of Trendon Watford was very interesting, because last year he played about 19 minutes a game, averaged over 7 points a game in that stretch. So his per 36s do look relatively good. And then also the fact that as kind of a face-up four with some playmaking capabilities, in only 19 minutes a game, he averaged over 2 assists as kind of a non-predominantly on-ball player, which I think speaks to his connectivity. I think he's definitely grown since coming into the league out of LSU, where I liked him quite a bit coming out of LSU. I thought Trendon Watford was a really intriguing player, and one of my big concerns is, what does it look like stepping out behind the three-point line? Well, he answered a lot of those concerns this year, posting real career numbers, even tracking back to his high school, college days as a three-point shooter. He played very, very well this year when it comes to the efficiency standpoint. Shot 56% from the field, which is remarkable, especially for his play style. You would typically think maybe a little bit lower, but he ended up shining. He shot 39% from three as well, and he actually backed it up at the free throw line, shooting over 72% from the free throw line. So I think ultimately Trendon Watford, again, a very big time surprise release. The big bugaboo on him is defensively. Is he ever going to be able to sit down and be a KBIF guy where he keeps the ball in front of him consistently? That's a question. And then also just team rotations. There's all those things that young guys have to learn coming into the league. But I think, you know, it was pretty surprising to see Portland cut bait on him this early on in his career, and I think he's a player who ultimately he'll catch on somewhere at some point. I'm hoping for my Mavericks that it's in Dallas, but I think there's a lot of other teams that should be looking at his services as a big positive addition, especially on what I'm going to assume will be a league minimum contract, just given the fact that he was not claimed after being waived by Portland. Moving on to number 5, and this is a lesser known player, someone who I think most people probably haven't paid too much attention to because he plays in a smaller market, and his role actually diminished this year as the season progressed because he just did not have a very good year for himself. But that is Jaylen Nowell of the Minnesota Timberwolves. I think Jaylen Nowell can play. I think flat out this guy's a baller. He's a real shot creator. I think he took a step forward this year as a passer. Now, not as much of a step forward as he needed to take playing next to Rudy Gobert, who I think, you know, was underutilized in Minnesota. I think that the Wolves as a team just didn't fully utilize some of the things that Gobert lets you utilize as a screen and roll guy, a backside rim presence player. And I think Jaylen Nowell was kind of the heart and center of those issues, which is partially why he fell out of the rotation by the back end of the season. But you look at his numbers and you might not be wowed by them. You know, he didn't put up a ton of points this year, despite kind of the expectation coming into the year that he would have been the sixth man. Naz Reid kind of stole the show from him. Now, he did put up 11 points per game, but in the league where scoring was at an all-time high, you would have expected those numbers to be a little bit higher for Jaylen Nowell this year. I think the Wolves were kind of banking on that when they traded Malik Beasley away in that package for Rudy Gobert. Ultimately, they didn't get the production out of Nowell, and I think the big bugaboo too, if you're looking at it, is that three-point percentage this past season. Now, here's the issue. For his career, very low volume so far between the few seasons he's been in the league. Last season, he shot 28% from three, but the year before, when the Timberwolves made the playoffs and Patrick Beverley jumps on the table during the play-in game, he shot 39% from three that year. So you're looking at a player who he's had some real variance. Is he a good three-point shooter, or is he a terrible three-point shooter? The reality is he's going to fall somewhere in between those two numbers. He's probably going to flatten out at a 33, 34, 35% three-point shooter. But if with some upward variance, he could be a really nice signing for a team. And coming off of a down year, you're probably going to be able to lock him in for a decently long contract at a very cheap number if you wanted to. And I think Nowell, for a player who is still very, very young, I think he's kind of the perfect skill set for a bench spark plug type. I think some teams should really be sniffing around Jaylen Nowell at this point. as kind of a scorer off the bench type of player. Not a real point guard. He's not going to run your offense, but he can definitely get buckets with the second unit. I think because of that, there's a variety of teams that could use that type of talent, use that type of shot making specifically. So I'm very interested to see where Jaylen Nowell ends up this offseason. Moving into my number 4 player now, I have Paul Reed of the Philadelphia 76ers, who is a restricted free agent. And I think that's very important to note. And that's partially the reason why Paul Reed, I think, is still out here in free agency, because the 76ers have really good control over him and their situation right now. Interesting to note, the Sixers were able to bring in Mo Bamba. They also were able to get a deal done with Montrezl Harrell. So we'll see. Are they counting on Paul Reed being back? My expectation would be yes, but I think it's going to be an interesting situation to monitor. And for Paul Reed, the statistical numbers aren't there to back up him being 4th on my list right now. 4 points a game, 4 rebounds a game. You're not going to be blown away by those numbers. But the one thing I will suggest about Paul Reed is, first of all, he's been kind of landlocked behind Joel Embiid. So first of all, your numbers aren't going to be there because you're playing behind the MVP of the league. Secondly, there are some very important things to note that he took big steps forward in for B-Ball Paul this past year. One of them, the most important one in my opinion, is free throw shooting. He went from a guy who was hovering around 50% or below from the free throw line to nearly 75% from the line this past season. So for me, Paul Reed is a player who, if he continues to take leaps and bounds steps forward with his development and really like showing focus in what he needs to get better at as a player, which I think this year he showcased a ton of improvement. He's a player that underutilized currently. If he gets to a situation where he's given some actual minutes and run and he plays 20 minutes a game instead of 10, we could see him probably step up big time in a completely different manner. So I'm looking forward to seeing what ends up happening here with Paul Reed. But I think he's a player that in the right situation, right circumstances, those traditional counting numbers would blossom and kind of rocket in a good way for him. My number 3 player now in free agency here is Kelly Oubre, and I say that almost skeptically because I'm not the biggest Kelly Oubre guy. But just given the fact on who's still out here, first of all, it's not a surprise to me that Kelly Oubre is still kind of waiting for a new contract a week into free agency. That is not a shock to me at all. He put up 20 points a game. You look at the numbers and you say, wow, how is this guy not signed? Just tell me one team that's gotten better by adding Kelly Oubre. There's just really not an example. And he's been on 4 teams at this point. Washington, went to Phoenix, went to Golden State. Now he's been in Charlotte, and none of those teams have ever really done anything with Kelly Oubre being a significant contributor. Now, listen, I think that there's skills that Kelly Oubre has when it comes to scoring the basketball, and he's got the size. You'd think, okay, defensively, he's got some length. There's some things you like, right? One of the things I hate is this guy played over 30 minutes a game with a very high usage rate, and he averaged 1 assist a game. For reference, a guy like George Niang, who played for Philadelphia this past season, he's now a Cleveland Cavalier, he basically never dribbled the ball, never had the ball in his hands, was a very low usage player, and he averaged 1 assist per game on significantly less minutes per game. Kelly Oubre does not know how to pass the ball. He's not a good playmaker. He's not a good connector. That's part of why he didn't work in Golden State. For me, I'm much lower on Kelly Oubre, but I think if you get him on a kind of team-friendly deal, not at that like 17, 18, 19, $20 million mark I'm sure he's hoping for, there can be some benefits to having him. But I think as a coach, you'd have to have a pretty tight rein on him. And I think that you have to set the expectations pretty clear of, look, we're not bringing you in to be an isolation scorer. We need you to connect some pieces every once in a while. And, you're going to sign him and play him as a guy who is probably going to look to score first, which that's not a bad thing. But there needs to be a tick up in his facilitating capabilities. And Charlotte wasn't a great team last year. I'm not saying Kelly Oubre should have deferred a ton more. I'm just saying that it's pretty embarrassing to average only 1 assist in 33 minutes a game in the NBA. Moving on to my number 2 free agent, we're staying on the topic of the Charlotte Hornets here with PJ Washington, another restricted free agent. We talked about that with Paul Reed. Now I think PJ Washington is a little bit closer to the cream of the crop than a guy like Paul Reed or Kelly Oubre. I think that there's a definitive line here between number 2 and number 3 for me, because PJ Washington is a player I like quite a bit, actually. 33 minutes a game this past year, put up nearly 16 points a game, 5 rebounds a night, over 2 assists a game as well, showcasing some of the playmaking feel he has a bit of at the power forward position. Now the splits aren't great. He shot 44% from the field, 34% from 3, and 73% from the line. For a player who his game kind of hinges on shot making at times, you'd want those splits to be a little bit higher, but he is still relatively young. The Dallas native, we'll see what ends up happening with him here in free agency. There's been a lot of rumors linking him to the Mavericks after Matisse Thybulle's contract was matched by the Portland Trail Blazers. I think for Charlotte, their preference currently would be to keep him, but I think it has to be at the right price point. And I think if PJ Washington signed an interesting offer sheet with Dallas, perhaps there could be, on that mid-level exception number, about $12.5 million a year, with maybe a 15% trade kicker and some of the other aspects you can throw into that. There would be some long-term fallout there for Charlotte having to kind of mull over that decision a little bit. Ultimately, I think they're going to land on the decision to keep him and to match that offer sheet, but I don't think it's a no-brainer, and I think that's an interesting storyline to follow. PJ Washington, probably the most interesting free agent still remaining on the board, but he's not the best one. The best one to me is Christian Wood, and I just don't really understand the disconnect around the NBA on Christian Wood. He's a good player. From a talent perspective, he does a lot of very nice things. Now, listen, I've never met Christian Wood personally, and I think that might have something to do with this, because I'm not sure if the personality necessarily meshes in the locker room or with the front office or what it is. But when you look at a guy like Naz Reid, who's been extremely celebrated in Minnesota, there's not a lot of things that Naz Reid does better than Christian Wood. Wood is a career 37% three-point shooter. He's an extremely athletic big, has all the tools to be a good roller. He's got nice touch, shot over 50% from the field this past year, 38% from 3, and he matches it with a 77% free throw percentage. So you're looking at a player who he's efficient when he's actually taking shots, and some of that comes out of self-creation, self-isolation, which maybe you're not drawing that up a ton, but he's got the ability to do that. And I think if you look at what Naz Reid really found a lot of success in, being kind of a sixth-man big, that's where Christian Wood can thrive. I think Christian Wood could be a better Naz Reid there. And I also think Christian Wood, obviously the big question about him is, well, what does he look like defensively? I know the Dallas Mavericks fell apart this past year. I'm not going to throw that on Christian Wood. Listen, Jason Kidd never trusted him from the start. I don't understand why. He kept going to Dwight Powell. Dwight Powell's not a better defender than Christian Wood. He's just not. Christian Wood has his flaws, don't get me wrong. He's not a good play at the level type of big. He's not somebody who you're going to feel great about a hedge and recover scheme. You're not going to feel even great about switching, obviously. And even the drop coverage kind of goes up and down with him. He's not a great defender, but he's lengthy and tall enough, and I think he's got enough defensive feel to at least make him viable with his offensive skill set, something I can't say about Dwight Powell. So for me, I just never really understood the disconnect between Dallas and Christian Wood, why the front office would trade a first-round pick for him if the coach didn't really like him that much. Christian Wood, for most of last season, was the second most talented player on Dallas's roster until they traded for Kyrie Irving. The fact that he didn't get higher usage, higher utilization, and just flat out more minutes was kind of mind-boggling to me. You saw games where he and Luka together were unstoppable. You think back to the Christmas Day game against the Los Angeles Lakers where he put up 30 points. That was the day he became extension eligible. The Mavericks chose not to extend him. I think the Mavericks have had a very good offseason for themselves. I'd say their team is significantly better now than it was last season, but it doesn't mean that Christian Wood was the problem. I think there's, again, people don't really understand those two things, that, look, a team can get better by losing a guy. It doesn't mean that that guy was the heart of the problem. I think the Mavericks had a ton of flaws. I think Christian Wood became the fall guy there in Dallas, unfortunately, and I'm hoping he gets to a situation where he's in a spot to win. Every single team he's played on has been extremely flawed. The Detroit Pistons during his tenure there, the Houston Rockets were a YMCA team, and the Dallas Mavericks had a lot of other issues outside of Christian Wood, and I think a lot of that stemmed from Kyrie Irving coming in via trade too. At one point last year, the Mavericks, pretty far into the season, were still the 4th seed in the Western Conference. So, people like to say, oh, the Mavericks were terrible last year, and I think a lot of that, goes on to Christian Wood, especially around the league. I think a lot of the thought is, oh, well, Christian Wood was a big part of the problem. I don't believe that for a second. And listen, I watched a ton of Mavericks games last year. I'm talking 60-plus Mavs games, of course. So, Christian Wood's not really the problem there. I think Christian Wood, very talented. I still think he's the best free agent remaining. I'm very interested to see if and when he gets signed, what that number will look like, because I think, he's going to be a bargain value addition for a team. And if he goes to a team like Milwaukee or a team with a good infrastructure, we could see something similar to Bobby Portis, where a lot of people looked at Bobby Portis as, a guy who doesn't impact winning, empty numbers, this, that, and the other thing. and then he gets into a situation where the team's ready to win. He buys into a role off of that, uses his skill set well, and all of a sudden everybody loves him. You know, everyone loves Bobby Portis right now, especially in Milwaukee. So you look at Christian Wood, I think it's all about landing in the right spot. Detroit, Houston, those weren't the right spots. Dallas, I think the fans actually like him a decent amount. I just think the management wasn't really on board with him as much as they should have been when trading for him, and I definitely think the coaching hated him, which I don't think there was a real reason for. So we'll see what happens with Christian Wood, but this has been my 10 best remaining free agents, and Bol Bol, of course, can't forget about him. Want to see him play in San Antonio. Let's get some Bol Bol to San Antonio hype down in the comment section right now. Hopefully you guys did enjoy today's video. It was a lot of fun to record. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content in the future, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.